How is it going? So, let's make the switch right here. Cool deal. So for this month, module of the month is going to be Sinon. Actually, a bit debates about like how to actually pronounce it. I was on GitHub the other day. The maintainer calls it Sinon, Sinon. And everyone I've talked to calls it something Sinon, Sinon, Sinon. So it's whatever you want it to be. Yeah, GIF. So essentially what I'll be telling you about here is, well, there's a description right there. Oh, snaps. Is Sinon has kind of like a utility, kind of like it does everything in terms of like testing. What it has baked in is something called Spies, something called Stubs, something called mocks. I'll talk about what this is, but it's not something necessarily that you want to do in your production code. This is really more for testing. So one example would be like, if you ever created a function and you want to kind of track how many times have I made this function call, how many times have I called it with a certain argument, or how can I count how many times this thing has done this like failure or whatnot. So that's what Sinon does with Spies. And it basically, you can think of it as kind of like an analytics for your code. And I've done a lot of stupid incrementers in my own code. So this is a kind of a helper for you. So dipping into this, the way you would create a spy is what you call it, is just by calling Sinon spy, right? And you just have like a generic function. And in most cases, that might be fine, but you really want to mess with your own code, right? So you want to pass in a function, or you want to pass in an object with a method. There's calls for that, as you can see on the first line right there. You just pass in your thing. And what your method or your function will do is it will just inherit all of the API that Sinon provides for these spies. So then you can go ahead and introspect what arguments have been passed into it with spy args. You can see how it's been called. You can see, hey, how many times have I called it? Also, which arguments have I seen through like the first time I called it, or the last time I called it, or the nth time that I called it, if you pass in some sort of index or whatnot. You could also check if it's been called once or not. So you kind of see a pattern that you are returning essentially booleans, and you're basically incrementing certain values. A lot of the times when you see things like this is in your assertions, right, and on all of your tests. This basically helps you do that so much easier and a lot cleaner than using your plus incrementers or doing whatever kind of internal counts. So that's what spies are. So one concept to know about Sinon is that all of these components, they work on top of each other like concentric circles. Another kind of object that's provided through Sinon is something called Stubs. So this inherits all the cool stuff that you get with Spies. And by the way, there's so much more like on the API site. Like there's a lot of different methods that you can call on this. I just like called out some common ones. So for instance, with Stubs, let's say you are testing out a new API and you have an idea of what kind of arguments you want to accept in a function or method, and you have an idea what you want to return, but you don't necessarily want to write the logic for it at this point. This is where Stubs come in. The idea here is that it has all the spies, it has that API, but then it also has things baked into it where you can say, this function, this method, returns this object, or it returns this number. Or when I give it this argument, it'll do this. Or when you do this argument, it throws stuff. So then you can start to kind of like play with your caches. So this is more in line with actually seeing your code inside of your application, how this object interacts with the rest of the app, the rest of the site, or whatever it is that you're working on. It's kind of washed out here, but you can see like my stub can return a certain value. My stub will throw a certain value. My stub on a call, so you can give it a certain argument, will then, and you can chain this together, will then return a certain value that corresponds with this. And then you have some things like yields, or you can see if a stub has been called before another stub, so you can kind of chain all this stuff together. And what a yield does is, you can override something like Ajax on jQuery object, where you can say, hey, yield this object, whenever you pass in some arguments, return this one value. So you don't necessarily have to make a connection to a server or any kind of API. You can say, when I pass in this argument stub, you give me this, because that's what I expect. It happens asynchronously, so you want to, or it happens synchronously, so you can kind of play around with that, but there's other parts in which you can do more advanced stuff. So that's what Stubs does. Pretty cool. There's a boatload of other things that Sinon has that I won't talk about since I have a limited amount of time. But one of the cooler things that I find about Sinon is the ability to create a fake server. And it has methods where you can fake an XHR object, which is pretty cool, right? But I think XHR is at a very, very low level, that if you try to override this and do stuff with it, you have to do it for every different kind of like request library out there. For me, it makes more sense to kind of just fake the server, because that's the output anyway, right? And the idea here, and this is kind of like the workflow, you initiate a new server. And then you say, hey, when my server gets like hit by some request with a certain URL, go ahead and respond with this. So you can put in whatever kind of like status code, so 200, 503, whatever kind of like headers you want to return, and then of course a payload. So every time I hit a server with this path, return this. And you kind of set up a whole like manifest of what you expect your things to be. And so in your application, you make your AJAX calls however you want to with whatever library, and it's going to hit this. Because it's overriding the XHR object. It's going to hit this, and it's going to return whatever you decide here in this place. And then once you're done with all your testing, you go ahead and do, hey, server restore, we're back to normal. I'm going to actually hit the APIs or the servers the way I'm intending to. So this is pretty rad in cases like, for instance, one situation I've had is there's an external team that is providing all the service layers for my application. And in my sprint, I have a certain job to do that I'm kind of blocked. I can't do anything if I can't hit these servers and get the data and actually go to town on my front-end application. With Sinon, I can just fake all this stuff. And I can instantly know in my application without having to wait for them what my application is going to do with like 404s, with 200s, with all my success and all my whatever. And I can see what these payloads look like, and I can design the API for them and say, hey, this is what I want. Go ahead and do this, because this is what's working with the application today. So you're unblocked, and that's pretty cool. So that's all I have for slides. I'll show you a demo of this real quick so you can see this working. Slide on over to Sublime. Bring this up a little bigger. OK. So we'll start off with this. I'm just setting up what a payload would look like, fake data. And it's just squares, and I got x, y coordinates with a radius. That's all it is. Pretty simple. Inside of line 15, I'm actually making this call to the real data that I have. So circles is an endpoint that provides the same kind of deal with a little bit different stuff. I'm going to go ahead and just comment out what the server instantiates and stuff would be. And then we'll see what this call is. And I'm making two calls, one for circles.js and then another for circles.js. So when we go into the browser, we can see, OK, this is going to do some stuff. And I just have it in the console log. See? So I'm pulling in the circles data that I have. So that's not the fake data. It's actually a real JSON blob. And I'm just calling it out again. This one was parsed, though. Yeah, I will do. That's really small, actually. Bam. So there you go. Another call. So this is the real deal call, right? I'm calling my server, and I'm saying, hey, give me the circles.json that has all this blob. So you see the data printed out right there as a string and then as an object, right? So let's assume that I don't have this payload in place. So I created a Sinon server. I faked the response. Basically, I'm using this faked it over there. It looks identical to circles, but instead it just says squares. That's my validator. And I'm making the jQuery call right here. And then at this point, I just stop. I just restore back my XHR object. And I can make another call. And this is actually going to hit my server, or my data in this case. Go ahead and see that. Come back over here, hit refresh. And now I got, bam, fake data. Same call, but the first one was fake data. So I pulled that in. That's all internal. I closed out that session. I don't want that fake server anymore. And this is actually talking to the real deal thing. So bam, that's how you do that. And this is great for you have your test. You have your initialization before you start testing. Set up the server, do my stuff, and then my test is done. So go ahead and restore back the session or whatever it is at the end of that test. So you can do this with your unit tests and feel pretty good about it. So I'd recommend you guys check out the documentation. It's very, very dry, very exhaustive, but play with it. And yeah, hope you guys like it. Thank you.